All right, good afternoon, folks. Thanks for tuning in for today's conversation about what it means to be anti-racist. For those I haven't met, my name is Lena Tenney and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. And I am delighted to have joined the College of Pharmacy recently as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. So a couple of quick logistics before we get into the primary content. Just checking in, your screen should have notified you and asked for your consent, but we are recording this session both for your use after the fact. For example, I know a number of folks might have to depart to another appointment right at 1, and we'll be going until 1:30. So never fear, the recording will be sent out to all participants and later will be posted to the public as a resource so that folks can use that as well. So want to make sure folks are aware of that, in particular to note that we want this to be a space in which people can ask real, genuine questions, and that can sometimes be difficult, particularly learning in public about something as taboo in our society as race, which we talked extensively last week about some of those taboos and stigmas and barriers. So recognizing that, if you have a question or a comment that you would like to contribute, but that you don't necessarily want your name attached to in the recording, feel free to go ahead and use the chat function and message that directly to me only. And that will be a signal to me that the person who is sending the message would like for it to be anonymous, but is still wanting to contribute that comment or ask that question. And that leads us into the fact that whatever participation needs to look like for you today, I hope that this can be a space that fits your needs. So to be extra clear, there's no expectation about what participation or active participation looks like. If you would like to have your video on, great. If you would like to have it off, great. If at any point you want to type something in the chat to share or to ask, fantastic. And if you don't have the energy for that today, fantastic. You're also welcome to unmute yourself if you would like to discuss something further, ask a clarifying question, add a personal experience, however you see fit to use it. The chat and unmuting yourself, you're certainly welcome to do. And again, no expectation that everyone has the capacity to do that today. All right, so with that said, we have talked quite a bit about the sort of like theory and realities of talking about race. And a really big question that has emerged for many, many folks than has necessarily in the past and has become a lot more public since the summer of 2020. We're actually coming up on a year since the kickoff of protests in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and others, right? So part of why this conversation is so relevant is that we see a historic and perhaps unprecedented amount of interest and active participation, not only from people of color in terms of fighting the good fight and doing the work of anti-racism, but that this is probably the most white folks, so folks with the dominant identity within our social structures, who are really getting actively invested and are paying attention at a much higher rate and paying much closer attention than many folks were previously. So welcome to this conversation, whether you are a longtime advocate and you are just looking for a couple more tools in your already robust toolbox, or if this is all still pretty new for you, particularly in the context of pharmacy as a field where this stuff has been talked about for a number of years, but has maybe not had quite as much of public buy-in in terms of how we're going to make changes for ourselves personally and for our institutions. So welcome. And the first thing that we have to do when talking about anti-racism is thinking about how we conceptualize this. And want to be clear, there's no like standard one definition of anti-racism that's universally agreed upon. There's lots of different perspectives that have been provided over hundreds of years, honestly, from all sorts of folks, particularly people of color who deal with racism on a daily basis. And gonna seek to uplift in this space predominantly voices of Black critical feminists. And that's just the academic version of talking about a lot of these folks like Angela Davis, you know, folks who signed the Combahee River Accords, talking about how the first wave of feminism was exclusionary towards Black women, and that if we're going to do feminism, we have to do anti-racism at the same time. There's a long history here. This will just be uplifting a few perspectives, but this is a sign that if you were paying attention to news coverage, if you were downtown in Columbus or elsewhere where there were protests, there's a good chance you might have seen a sign like this. The idea that silence equals violence, sometimes you'll see it written out as white silence equals violence. And in a lot of ways, that is really what underlies the idea of anti-racism, is the idea that to be anti-racist, you have to be doing something. You can't sit on the sidelines, you can't opt out, you can't say, I have no stake in this, or I'm a neutral party. That's just not really how it works. And to take that a little bit further, Angela Davis once said that in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist, and that there really is a significant difference between those two terms. And she said this decades ago. The term anti-racist has gotten a lot more popular again in the last year and a couple years prior to that, in particular because of the great success and public reception of the work of Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, who is a historian by training, who's a historian of race, and literally wrote the book about how racism has operated historically in the United States, and then went on to write How to Be an Anti-Racist as a sort of practical guide for all of us. And he notes that anti-racism is pretty complex. So he argues that anti-racism is not about who a person is. So it's not that each person is reduced to racist, non-racist, or anti-racist. It's that the actions that people take are either racist or anti-racist. He says there's no such thing as non-racist, it's one or the other. And so from moment to moment, decision to decision, is how we do the work of anti-racism. And all of us, whether we are white or people of color, have all inherited the system of inequities or along racist lines. And any of us are susceptible to making decisions that are racist or anti-racist in any given moment, even to our own detriment sometimes, because that's the power of racism as a structural system in this country and around the world. So when we're talking today, we're really going to be talking about decisions as opposed to who someone is sort of as a moral entity or person. So less about good and bad people, and more about what is that I personally can do in my day-to-day decision-making that will further the work of anti-racism. And going along this idea of the fact that there's no such thing as non-racist or non-racism, this art came from the Short North District here in Columbus over the summer. It's all lovely, but I want to direct you towards the mural on the right here. And this is a really famous quote from Desmond Tutu, who has stated that if you're neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say you're neutral, I'm just not that into politics, it doesn't affect me, et cetera, et cetera. We hear a lot of these rhetorics of non-involvement or apathy, right? And Tutu says the mouse is not going to appreciate your, quote unquote, neutrality in that space, right? So part of the work of anti-racism is recognizing that the elephant has been stepping on the mouse for hundreds of years in this country, and that is going to take all of us speaking together in order to provide some relief to that mouse and to advocate for those who have been marginalized within a system. And finally, as we conceptualize this, I really love this framing as well. A lot of the time, thoughts that I have had in my own journey and that I hear constantly, particularly from other white folks, is this concern about not doing it right, about being imperfect, about accidentally causing harm in the process of seeking to do anti-racism work. And want to point out, and there's an amount of literature about this in the academic space, but some folks have pointed out that the idea of perfectionism is a manifestation of white supremacy. That is a element of the culture of whiteness, perfection, never messing up, and certainly not in public, avoiding having to apologize. These are things that we see often in white culture that are not universal across the world, or even within the United States among racial and ethnic groups. So I want to point out that if you have this, and I'm a perfectionist by nature, right? So if you have that tendency, or if that tendency tends to be specifically within this anti-oppression realm, it's okay. You are not alone, right there with you. Got to check myself daily. And at the same time, that we don't have to let that be a barrier. We don't have to have that hang over us and have us be discouraged of like, well, can I really do anything? Because, you know, I could mess it up or it won't be enough, et cetera, et cetera. But instead, the author of So You Want to Talk About Race, excellent book, I highly recommend, talks about how you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be anti-racist, because anti-racism is a commitment. It's ongoing, it's long-term, it's day-to-day, to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself, right? Internalized racism, implicit bias, things like that. And that we really don't have a choice. That's the only way forward. We can't wait until everyone gets it perfect, because we've already been waiting a few hundred years, and we have yet to have anyone live a perfect anti-racist life, right? So for those who are new, I just want to say welcome to the conversation. And there is a lot of work to be done. You have certainly not missed your chance to contribute. Also want to give a few tips for folks who are newer to these kinds of conversations. One is which it's totally valid for folks who have been doing anti-racist work for decades or years or a lifetime even, to perhaps have mixed feelings sometimes about the burgeoning of folks, particularly white folks, getting interested in anti-racist work. So if you at some point encounter something like, I'm so glad that you are here in this webinar, and also it is wild that this was my experience over the summer, was the first time I did a webinar by this title. I just did it open to the public, and we ended up having more than 2,000 people log on and participate. And the Q&A extended it to like 3.5 hours or something like that. That was unheard of, even while housed at the Kirwan Institute, right? So being able to recognize like a lot of folks are just joining, and that can be complicated sometimes for folks of being like, well, you know, Black folks have been talking about this for a really long time. Why is it that in this particular moment, more folks are getting invested? So just recognize that that frustration isn't about you personally if you hear it or encounter it, and just honor that. Think, yeah, we're all on a journey. I might be newer on my journey. That doesn't negate the fact that I'm glad to be here. So if you're new, one of the things that we sometimes do implicitly is to assume that everyone else is new, or that everyone else has basically the same degree of knowledge. So just a reminder that there are folks who have been doing this for a really long time. We should listen to them and their leadership, and just think about the way that you communicate these things. So just remember that if something is new to you, it's new to you. That doesn't mean it's new to everyone. And how this sometimes shows up is when, for example, when white folks have read White Fragility as part of their anti-racist journey over the last year or so, and want to share what they've learned with a colleague of color. And perhaps end up sort of white-splaining this concept to someone who directly experiences the effects of white fragility on perhaps daily basis, just as part of navigating the world as a person of color, right? So it is really good to learn new information, and don't assume that people of color don't already have that information, if that makes sense. Additionally, I want to invite folks to always remember to give credit where it's due. This is not, might not immediately seem relevant to the pharmacy space, but I'll explain why. So a couple examples here. So on the right, we have, this is the statue of Christopher Columbus, that one that was taken down over the summer. And there was a lot of folks really happy about this, especially in a city named after Columbus, whose genocide was, is infinitely worse than history books generally lead people to believe, right? So there was a lot of people saying like, yay, we did it, the statue is down, this is wonderful. And a lot of the time it really just sort of ignored the decades of anti-racism work and decolonization work done by Indigenous advocates right here in Columbus, Ohio. So this is not a new issue. These statues have been problematic. and Indigenous peoples have been very vocal about this. And at the same time, 2020 is when there was enough critical mass and enough buy-in from non-Indigenous folks joining that call and supporting that and submitting petitions and writing letters to the editor and all sorts of things that function as sort of like social and political capital and end up making change in society. So the way we can reframe this is we can say, I'm so glad to see the statue taken down, since we shouldn't honor genocidal rapists. And at the same time, just want to shout out all the Indigenous folks who have been saying this for decades, and glad that we could come together as a community and support these things, right? And get this actually changed. In terms of relation to academia in particular, it might seem obvious or it might seem really small, but the idea is to cite Black women who have had these kinds of ideas. Talk about Black critical feminists being really the originators of a lot of this train of thought. So when you're doing your research, when you're doing your lit review, whatever it might be, to give credit where it's due, and to make sure that we are citing scholars who are people of color, not just white scholars. And how often in academia, the work of Black folks and Black women in particular is sort of invisibilized and sort of shut out from like high impact journals or not cited as much, things like that. So that's one element of where we need to give credit where it's due, particularly if you're doing work around diversity and inclusion within pharmacy. Also want to invite folks who are newer, really the baseline and the best guidance that someone can give you is to listen to and follow people of color. And that's for newbies who are white and for newbies who are people of color, although it looks a little bit different. So for white folks, invite us to educate ourselves first and foremost. We need to be doing that education work by joining webinars proactively, doing reading, things like that, and then show up, right? So don't stop at reading the latest anti-racism book, but make sure to show up as asked and as needed by people of color in a way that doesn't burden them. So one example is there's a lot of well-intentioned effort of white folks asking colleagues of color to do educational work around racism within the academy. And it's well-intended, and it also has this side effect of unintentionally burdening pharmacists of color to have to do extra work that is almost always unpaid, that can also be really emotionally difficult. And might not be that person's area of expertise, for example, right? So just because someone is a Black pharmacist does not guarantee whether they do or do not want to do free labor around educating non-Black people about what it's like to be a Black pharmacist. So consent is always going to be important here when we ask people to do extra work. That includes it's not that there are bad questions or stupid questions, but there are questions that can be answered via Google rather than asking your one colleague of color who might be answering all sorts of questions from all sorts of folks who have a new interest in anti-racism. But if you can do that work on your own first, then that can lessen the burden on people of color. So for folks of color on the call who might be newer to anti-racism work or approaching it in a different way than you did before, the invitation is to keep learning from experienced people of color. There is a lot to be said about the wisdom of not only elders, but folks who have been doing this for a long time. So still, like, it's about fine-tuning your own voice and your own style, and just being open to learn from folks who have experienced things firsthand that are kind of the only way you learn certain things. Also an invitation to stay in your lane, as we would say on Twitter, perhaps. This is the idea, again, that we should be doing what is our work to do primarily, and we don't need to be veering off into other people's lanes, especially without turning on our blinkers. So for white folks, what this looks like is our work against racism is primarily work to be done with other white folks. This is what has been asked by many, many folks of color, is for white people to come get your people, to talk to your cousins, your aunties, your siblings, your guardians, your parents, the folks that you know at a place of worship or a civic club or whatever spaces you inhabit. So to stay in our lane and do this kind of education and accountability work with other white folks at the same time not acting as a gatekeeper to the movement. So every white folk is on a journey of some sort. And it's not our role as white folks to say, you're not far enough along on your anti-racism journey to be in this space. We don't get to be gatekeepers of the space, but instead to be sort of eternally patient. And that those who are ignorant but want to learn have the space to do that, even if we've had that conversation a million times. That's one fewer time that your colleague of color has to sit down and like walk a white person through something that might seem fairly basic once it's been said. And for folks of color, remembering that elders do have a lot of that wisdom we talked about, just honoring that while also bringing your fresh perspectives and ideas. And this can even be as simple as framing things as, hey, I don't know if anyone has thought about this or if this has been done before, but I was thinking about XYZ strategy. Does that sound like something that would be of interest? And folks can then say like, you know, we tried that 10 years ago. It didn't work. Maybe we can give it a go again. Times are a little bit different. Or we can say, oh yeah, that is one of our primary strategies, and we need to make sure that we continue to do that. And a lot of this comes down to self-knowledge and self-examination and self-awareness. So a lot of the time, these kinds of webinars talk about social identities and what identities you have, the intersections of those identities. I want to take it a little bit further and use this concept of positionality. So the idea is, yes, it's about your identities. Yes, it's also about your power in society that can be influenced and shaped by those identities. And yes, it's also about your relationship to others and to the world in a broader sense. So it's not just listing off, like I would list my identities of like, I'm a white person who is disabled and queer and non-binary and has educational privilege. So those things are good for me to know and for me to think about the context of how am I perceived in society and in day-to-day interactions as a result of how those identities are sort of framed in society and how folks interact with folks with those kinds of identities. So yes, being queer, trans, and disabled means that I have a marginalized identity, and being white means that I navigate the world in a way that is has a lot fewer barriers than folks of color who might have the same identity or different identities. So again, it's really about relationship to the world and to one another. So with that said, I just want to name one of the elephants in the room, which is discomfort of doing this kind of work. And we talked a lot last week about some of the discomforts, the uneasiness, the uncertainty that can come with this. So I just want to normalize anti-racism work is always messy. It is inherently messy. It's not going to be clear cut. There's not a formula that you can just plug and chug numbers. It's about every small situation, reading the context and acting accordingly. So I want to invite folks to think about the power of speaking the truth, even if your voice shakes. Your voice shaking doesn't mean it's a less powerful message. In fact, if you find yourself asking yourself, should I say something? How is this going to be received? There's a decent chance that if your internal voice is shaking, that truth needs spoken, because it's the hard things to name in public, and particularly at work or in the classroom or in the lab, where those things are really taboo. So again, if your voice ever shakes, if you're unsure of how exactly to word something, you are not alone. And this is a really common experience, and it's one that we can't expect to just disappear. There are times when something goes down and my internal voice is a bit shaky, and my actual physical voice as I project and choose to say something can be quite shaky. And like, I'm paid to spend 40 hours a week thinking about this stuff, right? Like, this is my life. And I still get shaky or nervous or hesitant or uncertain sometimes. So just sitting with that and recognizing those aren't bad things. It just means that we're human and that this work can be hard to do. I'll let folks, I'll make sure to have the slides sent out along with the recording for everyone. And this is some additional reading. It's a pretty fast read, or I would say a very engaging read with a lot of takeaways. And this is from a dear friend of mine, Joy Ellison, who wrote in Columbus Alive about how a lot of the time, one of the barriers white folks have to doing anti-racism work is this fear of making mistakes, right? So because we won't risk being wrong, we risk nothing and thus maintain our own power and privilege. So one of the elements here is that anti-racism work is risky work. It means taking risks, and it means not that you won't ever be afraid, but what's that definition of courage? It's not the absence of fear, it's doing the right thing in spite of the fact that you're afraid. And that is what a lot of anti-racism work comes down to. And then Joy, tongue-in-cheek, but very honestly and transparently, says, you know, allow me to point out the obvious. Black people won't be surprised when we mess up. They've met us before. So we can't expect perfection of ourselves. And also people of color are not expecting white people to be perfect. There might be invitations to do better, to think about things differently, to repair harm that's done on accident. But no one is sitting around being like, you gotta be perfect to show up for anti-racism. So we can set that kind of expectation to the side. And knowing that this is really emotionally heavy work for anyone to be doing, I want to invite folks, both people of color and white folks, to think about these questions and maybe check in with yourself every once in a while on them, of being honest with yourself and asking, you know, what's your motivation to do the work of anti-racism? How do you sustain that motivation when you might be getting burnt out, for example? How do you continually examine your own motivations and hold yourself accountable, not only for intentions, but also outcomes? That we can be intending to do the right thing, and sometimes it comes across or ends up creating negative consequences on accident. And then thinking about how, you know, how do I examine, navigate, and enact my emotions in ways that motivate me to keep doing this work without causing further harm to people of color or folks of your racial identity who might be multiply marginalized. So thinking, you know, if you are an Asian American woman, thinking about that positionality and saying, yeah, anti-racism work is self-interested work in this sense. And despite being multiply marginalized, like also need to think through how I do coalition work with Asian American women who are transgender, for example, have additional marginalization that folks are navigating. And part of this is that since this is so emotionally intense in terms of the work that we do day to day, it can be easy to burn out or to start feeling like our support is conditional, and we don't want that to be the case, right? So the wisdom of Tumblr here, and I will just summarize here, is that basically this person is saying that this is about people, everyone deserving basic human rights. That's the whole idea of allyship, is supporting people in having those kinds of basic human rights. So if you hear something like men are trash or I hate men, a man being able to sit with that and recognize this message isn't about me personally, this isn't a personal attack. This is basically saying like patriarchy has caused a lot of problems in society and for a lot of women, right? So I tend to do the self-talk of if the shoe doesn't fit, don't force it on, right? If it's not about you, it's not about you. So if you're a man who is doing feminist work and supporting women, then when people say men are trash, that's not about you. And you don't need to defend yourself. You can be like, it be like that sometimes and recognize what that person is saying from their experience. Or if a person of color says something, you know, including swear words or like all white people are racist, something that might prickle skin for a moment, remind yourself, okay, this isn't about me being a bad or a good person. Like I'm committed to doing as much anti-racism as I can, and that's what I can do and will do. So making sure that we don't make our support conditional based off of other folks' behavior, because then it's not actually supporting basic human rights. All right, and checking in on emotional well-being here. These are just two things that I have found over the years to be really helpful in sustaining this kind of work. This one on the left is really geared towards everyone. And it's not directly from the Talmud, which is a Jewish sacred text. It's an interpretation of et cetera, but I want to give credit where it's due. So the quote here of do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. I don't know how many of us might be feeling the enormity of the world's grief. That pretty well describes how I'm struggling and surviving through, you know, the pandemic slash snowpocalypse slash insurrection slash everything, right? And so recognizing that and instead reframing to do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. And then you're not obligated to complete the work. None of us are going to be the one to complete it, but neither are you free to abandon it. So it's a both and. Yeah, we can't fix everything overnight. And that doesn't mean that we can't do something or shouldn't do something. And this one on the right, I want to invite folks of color on the call to really sit with in particular. I can't tell you how many friends and comrades have said that this has been really helpful for them to hear. And the idea is you're not required to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. So if you're a person of color, particularly if you are the only one in your lab space or at that pharmacy or in your office, reminding yourself, yeah, it's great to do anti-racism work, and you still got to take care of yourself. So you don't have to make all of these grand sacrifices that do harm to you in order to do the work of anti-racism. It's okay to set boundaries. It's okay to say no. That doesn't mean that you're not doing enough. It means that you're also taking care of yourself. And Audre Lorde once said that self-care is not a selfish act, but a political revolution for folks of color. All right, I just want to check in and give folks a moment, ask if there is any clarifying questions folks would like to raise over chat, or if you would like to unmute yourself. I'm just recognizing this is a lot of intense content in a very short time. So I want to give space to see if folks have questions or want to contribute some commentary at this point. Okay. Also gives me a second to catch my breath. All right, so feel free, again, to unmute or put something in chat now or whenever you need. I'll keep going for now until someone raises a question. We'll go ahead and pause for that. This is a tool that can be really helpful for folks, especially if you're newer to these conversations, or if you are working with folks who are newer to conversations. Maybe you are a person of color who has been, you know, sort of forced to do the anti-racist work in various spaces throughout your journey as a pharmacist. So this might just be articulating in a graphic things that you have already experienced. But the idea of becoming anti-racist, because it is a lifelong journey and about day-to-day decisions, can in some ways be broken down into three primary levels of how we approach things. So a lot of the time when folks are newer to something, and it doesn't have to be anti-racism work, it could be just about anything, like a new hobby, for example, the fear zone might be where we start. And so there can be elements like I deny racism is a problem, or I strive to be comfortable. When we move more towards the learning zone, then we start framing things differently. And instead of denying racism is a problem, we have capacity to recognize racism is a present and a current problem, not just a historical one. And instead of striving to maintain our own comfort at all costs, we can learn to be vulnerable about our own biases and knowledge gaps, which is not an easy thing to do for everyone. And then as we expand into the growth zone, we can reframe again and start saying, I actually identify how I unknowingly benefit from racism, right? Unintentionally, that there are things that accrue to me as a white person, for example. And instead of that comfort and yes, the vulnerability, also saying, I don't let mistakes deter me from being better, right? So that fear has really been sort of cowed, and we are willing to take some risk and be courageous here. So I invite folks to look this over more after the fact, but I know personally I found it to be really helpful. And that leads us into a conversation about what anti-racism looks like sort of in public and with other people. And there's a couple of different conceptions of this we're going to run through. They're all interrelated. One is not like morally superior to the other, but they are different approaches. And just like the prior circle where we're, it's not that we're stagnant in one place and then we level up to the next and we never, go back. A lot of the time it really is along a continuum of where we are right now. So allyship might serve you really well today, And in 6 months, you might be taking more of a coalition building approach. I don't know. It depends on what is most useful in the moment, right? So for white folks in particular, thinking about allyship is really about recognizing, like, I don't understand this lived experience as much as I might seek to learn and understand as much as I can, but it's about standing with folks regardless. And there is research about this, about how, in particular, folks with dominant identities, not just white folks, but for example, folks who are able-bodied, folks who are natural-born citizens as opposed to immigrants, right? Any dominant identity, there's some level of ally identity development. And again, it's a continuum here, a spectrum, as opposed to starting in self-interest, going to altruism, and then ending at social justice. There's no end. But similarly, we can check in with ourselves, where do I fall right now in this moment? And checking in with ourselves. So thinking about, we talked a lot about motivation, is the motivation selfish? It's for people I know and love. So when we think about, a white person might say, I do anti-racism work because I have a son, or because I have a best friend, or because I have a mentor who's a person of color. And it's not that that is bad. It's that it then shapes other things, right? So it's an awareness as opposed to a judgment. Altruism changes to other. I do this for them, saying something like, well, I just think that all people of color should have basic human rights. That would be an altruism. And then social justice kind of combines these, actually. So a social justice mentality, we think about the selfishness and the altruism, and it combines to say, we do this for us. We do this for all of us. And that's based off of some civil rights mantras, such as, your liberty is bound up in my liberty, so let's get free together. Or Audre Lorde's, I'm not free if any woman is unfree, even if her shackles are very different from my own. So this idea of collective humanity, and that's the goal, is that all of us get free together, as opposed to caring only about folks that we already know and love, or sort of in a more squishy sense of like other people that I don't know. It's a both and. Just a couple of notes and thoughts on this. So just a reminder that you never arrive at allyship. It's a continual process. We've talked a lot about messing up. Just clean up after yourself, just repair what harm's been done. And remember that anti-racism work and allyship isn't about you, and it's not about who you are. It's about those choices that you make, and to not center yourself. That it's not so important if you declare yourself an ally. What's important is if your actions are anti-racist. And generally, if you are doing the work of anti-racism, then people who are in that identity group are going to notice that, and are going to notice that a lot more than someone coming into a space and saying, I'm an ally, or I'm an aspiring ally. So, let actions speak louder than words. And one of the traps that people can fall into, myself included, is performative allyship. Sometimes this gets called optical allyship. And basically the idea is it looks good, but it doesn't have a whole lot of substance. And there's lots of ways that this can show up. So for example, there's nothing inherently wrong with having committees or task force or listening sessions or town halls about anti-racism by any means. When it becomes performative is when an institutional organization does those things with no intention of making any changes as a result, right? And whether it's intentional or it just happens on accident, we can see these kinds of efforts end up respectably stalling the work of anti-racism. So it's not that a senior leader says, we don't care about racism. It's that they say, let's have this town hall, and then 6 months has passed, and all of the valuable input that was given at the town hall still hasn't manifested into any kind of change of material conditions. That's the difference there. Training is good, and it needs to come with changes in systems and practices. And really thinking about, on a personal and an organizational level, is this prioritizing a good reputation, or is it prioritizing anti-racist action? And those two things will not always be in alignment as long as there's resistance to the work of anti-racism. A few more tips here, and there's a linked article that gets a lot more in depth here, but I just want to note a couple of things really quickly here, certainly not all of them. One is if you are in the dominant identity, being aware of content that can be traumatic or triggering, and being smart about how you share that kind of content. So a really big discussion just sort of on the interwebs and in real life last summer was around, how do we grapple with this idea of sharing traumatic content such as police shootings of Black people? How do we share it to raise awareness? But also, like, in what ways might that just put Black people in the position to, as soon as you log on to Facebook, you're just bombarded with these violent videos of people who look like you being killed by an agent of the state. So it's good for us to ask the questions. I want to recommend for folks of color, it's totally up to folks of color how they want to share that kind of content, particularly in relation to their own identity, and don't need white folks policing that. And for white folks, be considerate. And if it's something that you're like, no, we got to share this because there is not national coverage yet on this issue, then you can share a video, but make sure it doesn't autoplay, right? That someone has to actually click on it to go and see that body cam footage or whatever it might be, so that it's not auto-playing into someone's timeline. And give a content note. You don't have to say trigger warning. You can just say like content note or something like heads up, and just say like, this is a video of police violence, just so folks are aware. And then maybe say why you're
email if they answer me back.
It's okay to explain to folks like why you're sharing something that might seem kind of potentially traumatic or re-traumatizing for folks, certainly. Sorry, I'm trying to get my technology to work here. So in addition to allyship, we can also think about an approach known as solidarity. Bell Hooks articulates this incredibly well. Anything by Bell Hooks is going to be beautifully written, in addition to being wise, in my experience. But she talks about, it's not the same thing as supporting someone. Allyship a lot of the time is about support, but it's about having a community of interests, shared beliefs and goals that we all unite around in order to build. And in this case, she's talking about sisterhood. So we're really talking about like, how do we build a society in which we can rely on one another, trust one another, that we have shared goals in terms of, freedom for all people, for example. So she talks about how support or allyship can be conditional. It can end up being withdrawn. We shouldn't do that, but that's how that might function. But solidarity inherently requires sustained ongoing commitment. So it's not a one-off of going to one training. It's I am down to support colleagues of all identities, particularly when moments of bias happen. So it's a little bit different framing. And again, what resonates with you, feel free to take away, and different people are going to get different things from this, and that's great. A few other examples of what this looks like is the phrasing, this poster here, of solidarity, not charity. Talking about mutual aid, harm reduction, and this is from indigenousaction.org. So talking, we talked last week about how the question isn't, how can I help you? It's how can we get free together, right? So this is an example of that. And looking at intersections of systems of oppression, this quote is from Marcia, nicknamed Pay It No Mind Johnson, who is one of the transcestors at the Stonewall riot. And she consistently said, no pride for some of us without liberation for all of us. So asking this question of, can we really party in the streets every June until we do the work of anti-racism within our own LGBTQ community? And that's a compelling and needed question. All right, gonna pause here and set us up to watch this video. Just want to frame this briefly. So this clip is going to talk about something that goes a step further and is newer to the scene in the last few years. This is the work of Dr. Bettina Love. She does work on abolitionist education, and I just want to clarify what that means. So when she's using the term abolition, it's a lot of the time that harkens folks to think about like the era of slavery and abolishing slavery. So it continues from that. And abolition, yes, is about things like prisons and policing. And abolition is about a lot more. It's actually less about what we want to get rid of. It's more of what kind of society could be created in which everyone is safe. Everyone has the space to thrive instead of just survive. And how do we create that kind of society of mutual support? So what she's going to talk about here is her conception that she writes about of co-conspiracy. This example is going to relate to Bree Newsome. That name is not immediately ringing familiar. Bree Newsome is the Black woman who climbed the flagpole in, now I can't remember if it's Mississippi or Missouri, 90% sure it's Mississippi, and brought down the Confederate flag at the State House there. So if you remember that in the news a couple of years ago, that's the context here. So let me, pardon my slowness in technology here. All right. We'll watch just about 3 minutes of this.
I mean, I want y'all for a second to just think about the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad freed over 100,000 enslaved Africans and Black folks. Right? Think about this. There was no Twitter. There was no Facebook. There was no Instagram. This was all off trust and love of each other. And to say that this system of racism and bondage, no more.
Yeah.
We did that. It was everyday people. Farmers, bankers, doctors, teachers, nurses, all ethnicities. We did that as a country. Someone came to your door, gave you a code, you just had to trust them. And so I wanted to bring that back. What would it mean for us in 2019 to think about what it would mean to be an abolitionist and to be a co-conspirator? And in the book, I use James Tyson. Now, many people are not familiar with who James Tyson is. You know Bree Newsome. Bree Newsome was the young Black woman who took that Confederate flag down in South Carolina 8 days after Dylann Roof went into the AME church. And I tell the story in the book because I think this is an important story because Bree Newsome and James Tyson did not know each other. There were some folks who got together and said that flag is coming down. They said, and a Black woman's gonna take it down. They taught Bree how to climb. They had Bree's bail money ready. And that morning, Bree Newsome and James Tyson were at an IHOP. They got the word, come take the flag down. Bree Newsome climbs up on the pole to take the flag down. Now, this is where the difference between an ally and a co-conspirator is. James Tyson, now there's a gate for the flagpole. James Tyson isn't standing like outside the gate. Okay, like Bree, they coming, Bree. Hey, Bree. No, James Tyson, he is inside. And then the police say, you know what? We can get her down. Tase the pole. James Tyson, because he wasn't here, he was here, said, okay. He put his hand on the pole. That white man at that moment understood why he was there. He put his hand on the pole, and he knew that the police would not tase that pole with a white man, healthy white man, right there. He saved her life. That's what it means to be an ally. You can stand out there, and allies know all the language. They read all the books. They come to the meeting with all the terms. Right? They read the report before you read the report. Right? I always say allies make Black folks feel bad. Like, did you read the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book? Like, damn, I didn't read the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book. Like, you know, I've been busy being Black. Right? So I didn't read the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book, but I know it's fire. Right? So they come and they know everything and they good. And then after the meeting, you're like, well, what we gonna do? You're like, they left already? Where'd they go?
I'm gonna call it Uber.
I'm gonna call it Uber, right? So that's the difference between being an ally and a co-conspirator. You know, and this is back to that abolitionist, is to put something on the line for somebody.
Yeah.
Take a risk to see how to use your whiteness. And I tell folks all the time, whiteness is like a bank. And your ATM card just replenishes itself. So spend it. As the kids say, cash out. Right? Cash out. It's gonna come right back. And so to be a co-conspirator, I try to write in the book, is to take risks for somebody, to put something on the line, but to use it in a way in which you're using your privilege.
Yeah. Yes.
Use it. And I'm not just talking about white folks, I'm talking about cisgender folks. Use it for trans folks, like use it for queer folks.
Yeah.
Like put something on the line, take a risk.
Right, so the entirety of that talk, which I'll make sure to include the clip for, is just straight fire. So I encourage folks to listen to more of that if that has piqued your interest here. And that's what it comes down to, is the idea of taking risks. I'm not suggesting that every person of color on this call needs to climb flagpoles and pull down Confederate flags, right? That is one very small element of what anti-racism work looks like. And folks of color know that a lot of the time, it's not glamorous like that. It's not getting news coverage. It's standing up for yourself in the workplace, and you might not have to have bail money ready for it, but you might have to be thinking about how you preserve your career while also doing self-advocacy and saying, no, I'm not going to take that kind of treatment, right? And it's not saying that every white person has to put their hand on the pole so that the police don't tase it, knowing that white privilege reduces the chances severely that violence will be done, right? It's taking a risk, it's putting yourself on the line. And that means when racism happens in a staff meeting or in the lab, or if a customer or patient says something racist, that white folks, like it is part of our role to say something and to do something. And yeah, that requires some risk to put your hand on that pole. And maybe that customer, that patient goes off on you. Well, it's better for that rant to be directed at you, who doesn't directly experience racism on a daily basis, than for your colleague to have to deal with that rant, right? And there's a lot less risk. So for those of us who are white, and she talks about, white privilege is a bank, you might as well spend it and use it because it's going to keep replenishing it, right? Like your white privilege never runs out or goes away. So thinking about I might be taking some risk here. And it's so much less risk than my colleagues and friends of color would be taking to do self-advocacy. If I can do co-conspiracy, part of the value of that is recognizing the complexity of the fact that white folks are more likely to listen to white folks about anti-racism. They're much less likely to trust and believe and listen to and follow people of color. And that's not right, but that's the way it is in our society, is that folks with the dominant identity tend to listen more to other folks because they believe them to be objective, right? So again, it doesn't have to be as grand as this. You don't have to be marching in the streets to do anti-racism. If you are, great, we would be friends. But that it's these smaller everyday interactions that co-conspiracy also is really important for. And that we back up, for example, white folks, when a person of color on the call here speaks up initially, it's not only about being first to call out racism, it's also about backing up and supporting your colleagues when they identify racism, particularly if you didn't notice it until someone said, this is here, and then you're like, oh my gosh, it totally is. And then being supportive and saying, I had not noticed that. Thank you for pointing it out. We really need to fix that. Let's brainstorm some solutions. That is the work of co-conspiracy. And it's proactive as opposed to reactive. So it can include things, she talked about Bree Newsome and James now already forgetting his last name, they had a plan, right? Like they talked about this in advance. They analyzed, despite not knowing each other, they analyzed, what are the risks here? The risk is predominantly to Bree because of what action she'll be taking, but also because of her identities. So what can James do to help take away some of that risk, right? And that kind of planning in advance is totally possible in our workplaces, including in pharmacy workplaces, where we might not always talk about this stuff super openly. So here's the practical tips. I want to pause one moment to give another chance for folks to drop anything in the chat that you might want to contribute, or that you have a question, or if anyone needs to unmute and ask a question or make a comment, you're certainly welcome to. I see we're also just about to hit 1 o'clock. So again, a reminder, if you have a 1 o'clock and you need to hop off, you're totally good. No apologies needed. We got to do what we got to do, and this will be recorded and sent out to folks. All right, so continuing the fast pace of intense content. So we'll spend the last bit of our time together talking about, what does this look like in practical terms? Some of this might seem sort of more conceptual, but what are the day-to-day things that we can do? There's a lot. So the general framing that I suggest for anti-racism work is do what you can as you are able. This recognizes that not everyone can do everything. No one person is going to solve racism, and that it's not about seeking perfection. It's about seeking to do what you can, and then not guilting yourself for the things that you can't. This is also very much a pro-disability and disability inclusive framing, because disabilities can be one of the major reasons that not every person can do every type of anti-racism work. So as an inclusive approach, and some of how you might have seen this manifest over the summer, if you were seeing like calls for people to like get downtown or be in the streets or, anything like that. And I know I'm using a lot of like summer of 2020 examples, but I think it's really relevant. This kind of framing suggests, and it is equally valid to donate $10 to your local bail fund. If you can't be downtown, I have PTSD, and so there was about a year and a half that, and I'm an activist at heart, that I couldn't go to protests because I could not do any kind of loud noises, and I couldn't be in crowds because of the trauma of a car accident I was involved in, right? And I had to be honest with myself and say, do what you can as you are able. And right now, I'm not able to go and support in a way that I have traditionally. So what else can I do? And it can be things like sharing on social media, having a small conversation with a colleague or a relative or a friend, right? All of these are important and integral. And again, there's no moral superiority of what type of anti-racism work you are able to do. So here's a few of the ways that we can do the work. Think about what your strengths are, what you already are good at, and just channel some additional intentionality into that. That can be really powerful. So it can be things like educating other folks, doing empowerment and support work. It can be the logistics, right? So if there is a new anti-racism task force within your pharmacy and y'all are like, we're committed to this work, if you are a white person and it's not necessarily your sort of lane to lead this, you can totally volunteer to send out the doodle polls and analyze those in order to set up the meetings. You can volunteer to take notes, right? A lot of that like sort of boring, mundane work is the work that actually makes things change and move. It's just not like super public or highly appreciated typically, but that kind of stuff is stuff that white people can do like all day if you don't know what else to do, for example. Or if you're a person of color, you're not trying to be in the spotlight, you can still do logistics work, for example, right? Doing things like calling elected officials when there is legislation that could impact you and other pharmacists. A dear friend of mine who's now a chief diversity officer at San Jose State, Dr. Kathy Wong Lau, once told the story of how she got involved in diversity work was literally making copies, that she was in the Bay Area and would Xerox countless copies of flyers advertising for a community space for Asian Americans to talk about certain issues that were happening, right? And she was like, it's probably the most thankless work I've ever done. It might be the most important work I've ever done. And then at the end of the day, what are your ultimate priorities and boundaries? This is your truth. It's not going to, be universally agreed upon from person to person, but just being aware for yourself. And this makes this a lot more sustainable too, so that we don't tire ourselves out. So asking yourself, what are my ultimate priorities and my boundaries? Why is that the case? Being honest with yourself, is that motivated by fear or discomfort or by true limitations? So for example, if you are, whether you're white or a person of color and you see anti-Blackness happening, if you're a non-Black person of color, that's still a space of allyship, right? Just to support Black folks in the face of that particular type of racism. So to think through, is my my fear or discomfort of speaking up because my supervisor is the one who said it, right? That's a real condition that we should think about and take into context and think about asking ourselves, is that discomfort or that fear, is it motivated by the power differential? Or is it motivated by me not wanting to engage in conflict? And if there is legitimately an issue where you're like, yeah, I can't deal with that level of professional pushback right now for students, you've got to finish your degree. That may or may not allow much space for calling in faculty members who are responsible for your grade at the end of the day, right? So just being honest with yourself, and then pushing yourself beyond discomfort, but still staying true to your ultimate boundaries. There's like this sort of sweet spot where you can do what you can and still respect the as you are able. For folks with the marginalized identity, so for folks of color, just a couple of recommendations to uplift, including like knowing what your ultimate ideal world is, and what worldviews, goals, strategies, and rhetoric go with that. I uplift this because there's lots of different conceptions of how we are all going to become equal and how society will become equitable. Just know what your approach is, and recognize other people are going to have different approaches. And that doesn't mean someone is wrong or right. Again, it's not about moral superiority. If you have an abolitionist approach in the sense that you're like, I want to create a better world, and that requires that we fundamentally change some things in society, and another person of color has a reformist view and says like, the system mostly works, but it needs tweaks to get better. You might not agree on that, accompanying worldview because your ideal worlds look different, and that's okay. But we can reduce a lot of conflict sometimes within these discussions if we just recognize we're coming from different places. Make sure you're supporting and foregrounding the voices of people who are multiply marginalized within the community, kind of pushing against respectability politics, which is, if you aren't familiar with that term, it's essentially the idea that the way to get free is to have marginalized people become respectable enough to the dominant society. So the idea of like fitting in, assimilating, things like having your goal be demonstrating so much excellence that no one can ever like, I don't know, like blame your race for something, those kinds of approaches, being mindful of them. Like, yes, absolutely, like Black excellence all day, every day. And also making sure that doesn't exclude folks who haven't had access to higher education, for example. And then self-examining, because white supremacy and structural racism is pervasive, and it means that no one is immune to it. So even, if you don't believe in stereotypes, just recognizing there may be a time in which that kind of pops up and an implicit bias might activate against your will, for example. And this is just another reminder from Bell Hooks for folks of color in particular. Because this is something I hear often is when folks of color do anti-racism work, that a lot of the time what you encounter is some pretty clear hostility and even push out. And there's lots of academic documentation of this push out in higher education and in STEM as well. against folks of color who dare to speak up against racism. So a reminder, if someone seems out to get you because you're doing the work of anti-racism, you know, can you reframe it and remind yourself, like, clearly I'm doing enough as I am able to create some kind of discomfort or threat to the status quo. So that means I'm making a difference, right? If I'm getting some pushback, you're probably getting that because you are making a difference. And that sometimes folks have that hostility precisely because they see your power and are afraid of it, and don't want it to exist because it would create too much change, right? And that sometimes it's the time to be out there and sharing of yourself, and sometimes you need to not set yourself on fire to save the world, or to light someone else's candle. So Gloria Anzaldúa, who does a lot of work around you know, anti-racism, things around immigration and borders, she talks about how to survive, I had to go inside myself and I had to learn to breathe. So that self-preservation work, again, it's not hypocritical, it's necessary. And want to invite us to stay away from the montage. You know, I often hear, you know, if we get burned out, we're no good to anyone else. Or sometimes framed as you can't pour from an empty glass, right? So you can't give if you yourself do not have the fulfillment that you need. And that is true. And I also want to invite us to remind ourselves that our well-being as people and as advocates is actually important for its own sake, not only for what we can do for anti-racism, right? So your well-being and perseverance is itself a manifestation of anti-racism oftentimes, and that it's okay to guard your power. All right, for folks with the dominant identity, so in this case, white folks, I would also invite folks of color to think about how this might be relevant within internal community dynamics as well. So for example, like accounting for colorism, where someone with lighter skin might actually be more approximate to the dominant identity and might benefit some from that lightness, because a lot of anti-Black racism is colorism, right? And that folks with darker skin face the brunt of those kinds of discriminations, right? But that the baseline here is do no harm. So as a pharmacist, as an aspiring pharmacist, whatever your role might be, you're probably familiar with the Hippocratic Oath, and that it is, you know, it starts with first, do no harm. Same for anti-racism. We don't want to make things worse by intervening or trying to do this work. And then from there, be intentional about how we do that. So making sure we're amplifying the voices of the people who are marginalized. So it's not about grabbing the mic all the time. It can be about passing the mic, right? So if someone says or does something and you're like, I feel compelled to say something because that was racist, you can step up to the mic and say like, hey, I am not the expert on this. It's certainly not my experience, but I'm pretty sure that language is outdated. Does anyone else know better? Because I'd be happy to learn. And if not, then I've got some Googling to do and I'll report back to the group, right? That's opening up the mic and passing it, where if a person of color or someone with that identity is like, yeah, I do know what is the most up-to-date language, they can very easily and naturally chime in, hopefully without facing too much risk of consequence, because they're not the person initially bringing it up and saying this is racist. They are pointing out that they have knowledge about how to be less racist after you have already said this isn't okay. And it's not about going into marginalized spaces to do anti-racism work. So one way that this was framed over the summer was some religious leaders said, you know, white folks, you don't need to go to Black churches and talk about how much you hate racism. What you need to do is go to your predominantly white church and talk to those folks and those peers about how racism is bad. And a lot of this was calls from Christian pastors saying, you know, we need to talk to other white folks about how racism isn't Christ-like, right? Like that's the work of white folks who are doing religious-based anti-racism, not like going into spaces and telling Black folks like, I hate that racism is still happening. Like they know, and also hate that racism is still happening, right? And that includes in your workspaces, right? So thinking about how it's not necessarily that you need to join in with, and please don't join in with an affinity space. So affinity spaces are spaces created for mutual support by people with marginalized identities. So thinking about like an ERG, an employee resource group, for example, that can be a form of these kinds of spaces. But instead, to like be consistent in your everyday work, if it's a predominantly white space, to still be having these conversations about race and racism with other white folks, and also to widen the pipeline and help diversify the profession. Doing the work that you're asked to do, especially we've talked about the sorts that's not glamorous, the stuff that's tedious or invisible, like taking notes. When you are in a position to do so, to please compensate folks of color for their work doing anti-racism. So if the new committee does want to do some anti-racism education, understanding different racial identities better, that's fantastic. If you're going to ask a colleague of color to do that, make sure that you are compensating them as best you can. You might not have access to the entire budget, but if you can offer something, whether it's a gift card, buying someone coffee, or even just being upfront and saying, I know this is asking for free work. I tried to get some grant money, it didn't work out. Would you be willing? And I understand if not. Keep growing on your journey. It's never ending. And a lot of that is about the self-accountability and constant vigilance, not to be paranoid, but to take responsibility when we mess up, because we will. A few other thoughts. This was a really common question over, again, the summer of 2020. A lot of white folks, one of my siblings called and asked, I only have one Black colleague, and I don't know if it would be weird to check on him and ask how he's doing in light of all of these protests that are happening in response to concerns from Black Lives Matter. Like, is that weird or is it good? And the conversation we had was less about is it weird or is it good, and more about what's your current relationship to this colleague. If you don't know his name, if you've never had a meaningful conversation, yeah, it could come across as weird if you suddenly seek him out and are like, I just feel so bad about all of these things and all of these protests. And certainly, you don't want to make it about you and how bad you feel. She's like, no, we talk pretty much every day. We talk about sports and hobbies and kids and stuff. And that's been the case for, a year or however long he had been there. And then thinking through, okay, so if you have a genuine and reciprocal relationship, it's probably not weird to check in. If the person finds it weird, totally honor that. But yeah, it might be helpful to check in and just be like, hey, I know we talk most days about like kids and stuff, but if you want to talk about it, I just wanted to leave some space to recognize like there's a lot going on in the world, especially with these protests, to have to then come to work and be fully focused. So if you want to talk about it with a colleague, or if there's any point that you want some support, or for someone to chime in a meeting or anything like that, I'm always happy to talk about that kind of stuff. That could be a more sort of natural discussion for folks. And then asking for consent. So consent is really, really important when asking marginalized people to share their traumas, their experiences, their knowledge, because you don't always know what's going on in someone's life, right? So when you ask those questions, remind yourself that your curiosity does not entitle you to an answer. It would be nice if the person was willing to sit down and educate you or talk about it. It's also not required. That's not their job, probably. So when folks say no, just respect that and understand. There could be a million valid reasons for why they're declining. But here's a sort of general idea of how to articulate this of like, I really appreciate you talked about how being Latinx influences how you interact with patients, including having to deal with racial microaggressions. At some point, would you be open to me asking you some questions about your experience? I'd be happy to buy you coffee if so, and also totally understand if not. That's a way we can open the window, say, hey, I would love to learn more or talk with you about what this experience is like. Also come offering solutions as opposed to only questions. And then if folks say yes, great. And if they say no, great. Here's an example of some of those open-ended questions you can ask or things that you can offer. So asking like, for example, if you if you are aware of a consistent conflict or consistent set of microaggressions between two people in your lab or the pharmacy or your classroom, and you know it's identity based, for example, like if there's that one person that pretty consistently says terrible things and it offends, rightfully so, the other person who has the identity. One of the things you can do for co-conspiracy is to talk to the person and say like, hey, I've been seeing this pattern happen over and over. And I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing if you wanted to talk about it, and also offer, what would support look like for you in the workplace? Is this the kind of thing where when I notice this happening, you would like me to intervene? I could address it directly, or I could just like change the topic, like whatever you're comfortable with, I'm happy to do. And so that planning in advance is a lot of that co-conspiracy piece. I'll give one sort of parallel example. Part of this was when I came out as non-binary and started using they, them pronouns exclusively. A lot of the conversation was around coworkers and friends who had every good intention and just like had a hard time transitioning, as it were, to a different pronoun out of habit, right? And so a lot of that conversation was, in work meetings, if I am misgendered by someone who's like way up the line of authority, my colleague who asked how I would like for that to be treated and what support would look like, I asked like, no, please don't interrupt them and like shame them and call them a horrible transphobe because they didn't know my pronouns, right? Like that's just going to come back on me as someone who like will probably face the consequences more than you will. And that's just like not my style. But if a coworker that I know has no malintent refers to me as she in the meeting minutes, and you notice that, yes, I would love for you, like, don't even need to ask me. Go ahead and send an email and be like, oh, hey, just a reminder that Lena's pronouns are they. So I edited it in this document. So it's very deeply personal what kind of support people want or don't want, and that's okay too. All right, so that is a lot. I'll leave you with this and then a quote, and this is something really to be perused more later. But thinking about how our individual level actions and our actions within systems and within groups are all really intertwined. And this is specific to white folks, but I think can also be translated in a lot of ways to dominant and marginalized identities in other areas. Where we're talking about on the personal level, learning, understanding, reflecting, and then taking action. So that includes things like getting comfortable having dialogues about race and identity with vulnerability. That takes effort, certainly. Things like name racism and racist behaviors and norms. Actually calling something racist, that's a pretty big taboo sometimes in society. So to have the courage and actually say, like, hey, this is producing unequal outcomes racially, which means it's a form of racism, honestly. Like, we don't want to be perpetuating that. Let's see what it is we can do to change our policy or practice to bridge that gap and eliminate that disparity. And particularly at the system level, particularly for those who have institutional authority, like if you have the job title that puts you in charge, as it were, think extra about system level change, because you really are in a position to influence that in small and big ways. So things like encouraging critical organization, reflection of policies and practice, right? And doing it proactively, that you don't have to wait until there is a complaint from someone that racism happens, but thinking through proactively, how do we prevent this stuff from happening in the first place in order to create spaces that are braver and safer for all people and spaces that are anti-racist. So I will leave you with one of my all-time favorite quotes from Angela Davis. And she once said, "I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept." So her reconceptualization of what's traditionally known as the Serenity Prayer is really powerful, I think, and really sort of undergirds this idea of what does it mean to be anti-racist, to become anti-racist, to do things that are anti-racist. And it really is about identifying the things that need changed and then doing what needs done to change it. because we can't keep accepting racism, whether it's explicit and overt or whether it's implicit or covert. It's causing harm to folks on this call, to folks who are not on this call, to our colleagues, our friends, our neighbors, our mentors and our mentees. So that is the joy of anti-racism work, is that there's always plenty to be done. And there's so many different ways to do it. And what you can do definitely makes a difference, that is for sure. So with that said, I wanted to leave some space if folks had anonymous or non-anonymous questions. For example, if there's like a scenario that you're dealing with of like, this is what's happening in my workplace, you have thoughts, it could be something like that. It could be clarification, but a reminder, this has been recorded. I'll make sure to send the recording and the slides to you. You can click all the hyperlinks to your heart's content if there's something that really resonated with you that you want to look into more. But thank you so much for investing this amount of time in this kind of conversation, and for being committed to doing anti-racism work. This is the kind of stuff that changes the world and changes pharmacies and academic spaces and labs and all sorts of places in society.